Hello and welcome to another episode of our show 28.4 FM, connecting India's youth to the world through discourse. I'm joined today by my Mumbai based co host Sanskruti. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a 30,000-foot view of India's biggest foreign policy challenges and opportunities. In case you have noticed, things are a little confusing right now, and there are a lot of disruptive events across the world, including the COVID-19 pandemic and escalating tensions between a host of different countries, including India and China. The conversation is fairly wide in scope. We're going to be talking about India's escalating tensions with China, India's growing ties with the United States and the significance of that alliance, as well as ways in which we can upgrade our state capacity, especially as it relates to the Indian foreign services, so that we can better realize our global aspirations of becoming a superpower. So because these topics are very confusing and very sort of complicated, we have with us an expert in foreign policy to help break down these trends for us. So thank you so much, Dhruva, for joining us. Dhruva Jaishankar is the director of the US initiative at the ORF. Dhruva's research has spanned issues such as India-US relations, India's relations in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, the interaction of technology with politics, defense, and national security as well. And so you'll see that all of these issues are directly relevant to our talk. And Dhruva is sort of my go-to for anything foreign policy related. If there's any sort of foreign policy development, I immediately turn to his Twitter to see what he has said about it. So I really appreciate you coming on, Dhruva, and we're excited about this conversation.
Thank you.
Definitely. I mean, I've on YouTube, I've searched Dhruva Jaishankar and I've heard almost all his talks. And something that is significant that I've realized is during the beginning of his talk, like at universities or institutions, you talk a lot about young people and how it is important for young people to be in foreign policy, know more about international relations, what's going on across the boundaries of the Indian territory. And something that I would want to ask you is, why do you think and why don't you paint a picture for a young audience as to why foreign policy is important now more than ever? And also, what motivated you to make a career or pursue a career in foreign policy?
Thank you, Sanskriti, and thank you, Abhishek, for the questions. I really enjoyed this opportunity. As you mentioned, I find it very useful in India, particularly to interact with younger audiences. It's more rewarding. I get very good questions, that challenge my own views on things. So I find it always very rewarding to talk to audiences like this. So why is foreign policy important? I mean, I've made the case that I think foreign policy is important for every single citizen of India. Some more than others, but everyone is directly or indirectly today affected by some element and some elements of India's foreign policy. I think the most striking recent example is unfortunately a negative one, which is the coronavirus pandemic, which did not originate in India, but has come to India. And today, India has the second largest number of cases, third largest number of fatalities, unfortunately. But, and much of the rest of the country has been economically affected by the implications of that. So, I mean, that's just one more recent example and a negative one at that. But I think we can think of lots of positive examples. And I'll give you a few. One is the telecom revolution in India. And the change that we saw between roughly 1990. I'm perhaps sort of the youngest generation of people who can remember a sort of pre-liberalization India. And it was very difficult to get a phone line. Making a basic phone call was so difficult. And by 15 years later, everybody had a mobile handset. Now, this didn't happen by accident. It took a number of steps and some important policy decisions, both domestic and foreign, to enable that to happen, to enable the setting up of an infrastructure around that. And now that is being developed on, and today a mobile handset is connected to almost every other aspect of life. Whether you get rations, your banking, so many things are connected to it. So that's one example. Public transportation is another good example. 20 years ago, people said that it was impossible for India to have rapid transit systems in most of its metro areas. People thought it would be unsafe. But yet, starting with the Delhi metro, you saw a new wave of infrastructure building in urban areas in India, and broadly again to the benefit of average people. Just to give the example of the Delhi Metro, again, it was not an accident. It required getting financial assistance from Japan, getting technology and equipment from South Korea and Germany. It required getting training for people initially from Hong Kong. And today, India is now an exporter of some of this equipment and know-how. So again, this is another example of how the day-to-day lives of people have been affected by decisions made of policy. A third example I would give is public health systems, which is today, if you look at the per capita incomes of India, it is roughly the same as it was of the West in the early 20th century. But our health indicators are comparable to the West in the 1960s or 1970s. So in some ways, the health system is 60 years ahead of our income levels. And that, again, is no accident. It required working with international organizations. It required the role of international foundations, such as the Gates Foundation, was crucial. So again, it required getting, sourcing that external technology, investment, knowledge from abroad and making it available to people in India. So again, these are some very mundane examples, but today, whether it is what car you drive, where you can study, what the price of your dal and onions, I mean, all of these things are actually related to foreign policy.
It's been a tough few months for us as a country. As someone who's sort of in the weeds of foreign policy and especially India's foreign policy, what are some of our inherent strengths that give you optimism about, our chances of aspiring to be a global superpower and actually becoming one?
Mm-hmm. So, I was unusual. I mean, this partly addresses the previous question in some ways. I grew up both in India and abroad and moving back and forth. Traveling abroad, traveling widely in India. And one of the things that occurred to me, and this was again at a time when India had less resources, than it does today, is I never got the sense that India and Indians were inferior to other people. Some of the smartest people I've met are Indians. Some of the most ambitious, innovative are Indians. And so, I don't think there's this idea that India cannot do anything. I'm not saying that there aren't challenges ahead, and I think I'll get to some of what I see as some of the challenges, but this idea that India should not aspire to bigger and better things, I think is just unfounded, and it's self-defeating, and if you have that attitude, it significantly impedes any chance of progress. Now, again, there are some significant challenges. There are resource constraints. India still has them relative to most other countries. You have very entrenched interests that don't want to change because they benefit from the status quo. And oftentimes in India, overcoming those entrenched interests is a challenge. You have a mixture of old regulations with new regulations, often which contradict each other. And that makes lots, doing, whether it's business, whether it's setting up a nonprofit organization, anything much more difficult in India. So again, these are the challenges that I think India faces, and many of these are self-imposed or are legacy issues. But I remain optimistic because I don't see anything in the Indian spirit or particularly the human resource potential that we have, not just the gross population, but the talent that is there. That doesn't mean that India cannot achieve what and today, by the way, and there's evidence of that, which is today you see in almost every field pockets of excellence in India which are comparable to the best of the world. So no matter again what the field is, you have people doing things in India which are comparable to what the best and brightest in the rest of the world are doing. The challenge today is getting that to is broadening that and making sure that everybody in India has those opportunities that would be available in a developed country. So again, all of these things are, for all the challenges that India faces today, I think it has come through far worse before, and there are many reasons for continuing optimism.
I just want to quickly follow up on that. The one topic that we're going to get to is India's relationship with China. But as we think about the rise of these, or the resurgence, because these two countries have an ancient history that goes back thousands of years, and they've been superpowers in the past. But in China, you have a one-party state model. In India, you have a multi-party democracy model. Do you view our democratic setup, along with its rule of law, checks and balances, whatnot, as an inherent strength that makes us more sort of attractive to our potential allies abroad? Or how do you view this dynamic of one party China versus multi-party India?
I mean, I'm a proponent of democracy, partly because I think the historical evidence points to democracies delivering better for people and proving more resilient over time. So for all their faults, and there are many flaws, the ultimately there isn't a better system for governance that will have longer term effects. I mean, I think we can say with reasonable certainty that again, there are many challenges to India's democracy as well, but that India will remain a democracy, even if a flawed one, for some time. The same cannot be said of authoritarian countries, which, we just have to look at what happened to the Soviet Union and the former Soviet republics 30 years ago. We just have to look at what's happened in West Asia and the Middle East in the past 10 years ago, and with the Arab Spring. And a lot of these places where people thought these were solid, Syria, Egypt, countries under a strong, a good, benevolent strongman, have today disintegrated into civil war, chaos, bad governance. So, I think, and I mean, you just look at China's own history, right? You had periods in the 1970s where you had purges. That's not that long ago. You had the Tiananmen Square protests in the late 1980s. You had a Tibetan uprising in the late 1950s. You had the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. So you've had a series of disastrous policies. Now, what China has accomplished over the last 40 years is remarkable. And some of it has to do with the strength of a single party system that benefits from less deliberation and more of a, I think more than the lack of democracy, it's actually been the revolutionary zeal of China that has enabled it to leapfrog and move in as quickly as it has. But I don't think that means that the democracies are necessarily inferior. I think, again, if you were to take China out of the picture, what India has managed to accomplish in the last 40 years as a democracy is quite a remarkable story, which is pulling, by conservative measures, 220 crore, 200 million people out of poverty, while retaining a parliamentary democracy. So, and a federal structure. So I don't. I'm not pessimistic about India's democracy. I think the record shows that it actually, when decisions are made, and sometimes they're imperfect and they're too little and too late, but when decisions are made, they tend to be permanent because they've had the general buy-in from the population at large.
We'll get to China in just a second, but I want to actually start off with your sort of broad views on India-US relations. I mean, it seems increasingly clear that there's some kind of decoupling going on between the two largest economies in the world, the US and China. I'm based in the US, and people here talk a lot about Cold War 2.0 between sort of India and China, and sort of a bipolar global order with an entrenched sort of hegemon, the US, and then a challenger state, which is China, and they're close on our heels. What sort of relationship do you envision for India and the US? Is this going to be the defining sort of alliance of this Cold War 2.0 era? And sort of what are some of the key opportunities in terms of increased cultural, economic, and military ties between the two countries? And then we'll come to the challenges a little later.
No, so I hesitate to call it a budding alliance. It is obviously a much closer relationship, and it is getting closer. The trend is in that direction. This is a trend that has been going on since the possibly even you can say 1985, but really after 1998, it took off in some ways. What is driving that relationship? I mean, largely two things. One is greater strategic convergence, meaning that the US and India have very similar concerns about the implications of China's rise and its behavior. And we only have to see what is happening in the India-China border situation today to reinforce that view. So I think there is a convergence of interests between the US and India at this time on the China question, and also on other issues, multilateral security, on terrorism and other things. I mean, China is I think the most important, but there are other areas at play. The second is a growing bilateral relationship, and some of it is, in some ways, the formal metrics of that relationship, meaning trade, investment, and so forth, don't fully capture the importance of the relationship for the two countries, which is a lot of it is based on sort of more informal R&D, research and development cooperation, back office work, Indian investment in the US, Indian students in the US. If you take collectively all of that, it's a much more important relationship, bilateral relationship for the two countries than they often, that is often, I think, appreciated. So this is where, I see this emerging as an important partnership. One could make the case, I don't think it's yet the case, but maybe soon, in the 10 years, that it will be one of the most important partnerships in the world. When if the US retains its position as the number one, or even if it is surpassed by China, but if India is to manage to move into a sort of number 3 position after in the next 10 to 20 years, then clearly I think the emerging cooperative partnership between India and the US will by default be one of the most important bilateral relationships in the 21st century.
As you think about some of the challenges and pitfalls, as you mentioned, we are a democracy, and in the past year or so, we've gone through a few contentious sort of laws and decisions in our own country. And there has been criticism from the West, especially from the press. That criticism hasn't really translated into any negative policy outcomes, specifically towards India. In this view, do you think realpolitik or realism, which is the inherent strength of India as a market and as an ally, will sort of be able to overcome all of this negative press? And what should we be concerned about a change in potentially global opinion?
No, global opinion will change. There'll be periods of time when India will be celebrated in the global press. There'll be periods of time when India will be criticized in the global press. But beyond a point, what does it matter? And I think for two ways it matters, or potentially matters. One is if it results in adverse policy. I think that's quite clear. And the second is if it results in adverse business opportunities.
Yeah.
And if investment declines and so forth. Now, while let's set aside the merits of any criticism or the lack thereof. The question is, what should India be? What should really matter from an Indian perspective? I think a few things to keep in mind. One is that largely, businesses have proved remarkably amoral. And I'm not saying this necessarily in a positive or negative way. I think it's just a fact, which is you still have US businesses doing a lot in Xinjiang, despite much, significant concerns about human rights there. They are not, some will, but many will not move out of Hong Kong. They still do a lot with Saudi Arabia, despite, again, significant human rights issues there. So business has been often quite resistant to following the press or government outrage on this. Now some of that is changing with respect to China, but only I think because of a convergence of interests and values, well, both interests and values when it comes to China. You see very little criticism of Vietnam, which is a single-party authoritarian state in the Western press. So I think you're right that there is a sort of realist. We will work with people when it's convenient, and overlook what we see as adverse behavior on their part. But at the same time, I think this is also a case where there is a sort of convergence of interests and values at play. So I'm not saying that sometimes the negative press, particularly the negative press of the business publications, which are seen to be more objective, could have a spillover effect into the US-India business relationship. But I wouldn't overstate. Also, I would hesitate to overstate the significance of some of that criticism. Some of it will be forgotten after a little while, and some of it just is played up in the Indian media because it is used. They're using the New York Times or whoever, or the Economist as ammunition for India's own domestic debates. So again, for all of these reasons, I don't think it's getting as much play in, outside of some elite circles. And again, this is not judgment. This is just an observation.
Fact, that's actually happening.
Well, it's just observation. I mean, I think what has happened in J&K, for example, beyond a very small elite in the US, is, average people in the US don't know anything about what's happening in J&K. And at most, they will have seen one headline somewhere a year ago, and something happened there. So we tend to obsess over our own issues. So in India,
yes,
Article 370 is a big change. It's a big development. But the idea that this is somehow a talking point in living rooms across America is completely unfounded.
So this does not have any impact into the foreign policy of a nation state, like a domestic politics policies such as 370, CAA, the protests, massive protests, and like when we talk about police brutality in the United States, we also compare it with India. So domestic policies does not have not even a 0.01% of impact within like the foreign policy of a nation state, or is it just in our heads?
No. I wouldn't go to the other extreme. I do think it has implications, and sometimes very important ones. I mean, the fact that the CAA protests appeared on the front pages of U.S. media. I mean, this is the first time in 30 years that something like that had happened. So again, I'm not saying that it doesn't have any effect or it's not resonated at all. Members of the US Congress get calls and letters from their constituents who've been critical, which means that they raise it up with their government, which means that it does lead to official discussions. So again, I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, but sometimes all I'm saying is sometimes there's a tendency for every minor statement made by some candidate for office in Europe or the US to be amplified in the Indian media. I noticed this, a few US presidential candidates did make statements about internal affairs in India. Those were one of 500 statements they made and that their campaigns made. It is not like a central to their policy platform by any means. It was often to cater to a particular constituency in the US. But in India, this got played up as, this is going to be the defining feature of their foreign policy. So all I was saying is I think sometimes there's a tendency to overstate that just based on the different interests that we have in different countries and different things that we pay attention to.
And this brings me to like the nature of foreign policy that India is looking at as at the moment, because we see like a decade ago when we had a certain retaliation, we had cross-border differences between our neighboring states. What we used to do, we used to impose sanctions, we used to cut like trade, but what we are doing right now is we're banning apps. Is this the new way? Is this the digital is this how foreign policy is going to where are we heading is my question.
So it's interesting. I think we're at the cusp of a new phase, which is if you look at goods trade, trading goods per se, that is that's been flat globally since 2008, meaning as a percentage of global GDP, it has risen, but as a percentage of global GDP, it's actually declined a little bit since 2008. So we can see the post-2008 phase, post-global financial crisis phase as a period of some stagnation when it comes to globalization, including trade globalization. In some ways, that is because of the WTO, because people have dropped tariffs largely. There are still barriers to trade, but because they have dropped so much, there's very little that is no longer a value add in the future. The biggest drivers of growth, of economic growth in the next 10 to 20 years are likely to be the harnessing of several emerging technologies, including using existing digital technologies, but adding on layers of artificial intelligence and machine learning, adding a robotics and automation element to it, using 5G as the connectivity, as the information connect between these systems. Those who can master this will actually generate the greatest revenue in the next 10 to 20 years. And so the race is on but this extends to other things. There'll be some breakthroughs in manufacturing and energy and biotechnology as well. But there are a number of emerging quantum computing as well. There are a number of emerging technologies which are going to be the big drivers of growth. If there is going to be higher rates of growth in the next 10 to 20 years. So the race is on to master that. And so the punitive measures today that people are taking are not over the comparatively small issues of goods trade. I mean, Trump is imposing tariffs on China and others but that's largely to cater to very specific unions or an older voting base. But the real game that is on is in these emerging technologies. So whoever has access to the digital market will be the most powerful. So if you see, that is why these debates over 5G have become so heated. Why it matters whether the UK lets in a Chinese company or not. If you look at the current valuation, the current economic impact this year of these decisions, it's minuscule. The question is what it's going to have a long-term effect. For India, the fact is China has been able to produce mobile hardware at a very low rate and is able to corner the Indian market as a result of that. So Oppo, Vivo, all of Huawei, ZTE, and all of that, Xiaomi. And they're able to do it. One of the things they do is they link the software to the hardware, again, making it cheaper. So the second largest browser, for example, used in India after Chrome is UC browser, which is a Chinese linked to Chinese handsets. So they've effectively got, through this, have got the second largest market share in the Indian browser market. That allows them access to a certain amount of user information and so forth. The app ban effectively raises the cost of Chinese competitiveness in this entire sector. So it's not even about the individual apps per se, but it is to make it more costly for China to compete in this market space. So I think the future policy is going to be driven by these sets of policies. Less, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but less and less by traditional trade practices.
I think the app ban does one more thing. It potentially denies these apps access to 1 billion users, because AI's development depends on its ability to adapt and learn based on data. So I think that is significant. I want to move on to the China-India conflict. So let's quickly go on to that. Coming to China itself, what explains the timing of their actions? It's not just the Galwan Valley clash with India. It's also actions in South China Sea. It's also Taiwan. It's also the national security law. And all of this is coming close on the heels of a global pandemic, which originated in Wuhan, over which there is so much global scrutiny over how this virus originated and whatnot. So according to you, what is behind the timing of some of these actions? And do you see an off-ramp specifically for India and China, because the security situation is worsening every day?
So the short answer is I don't know. And the other honest answer is that nobody quite knows, meaning I speak to people who follow China and internal developments in China very carefully, who have very well connected there, and they don't have, they have some tentative hypotheses for why we're seeing this behavior all around, but nobody has a clear sense. Even Chinese experts themselves haven't provided a clear indicator as to why we've seen this behavior. A colleague of mine, Andrew Small, and I, he's more of a China specialist. We actually wrote something a little while ago in War on the Rocks, where we looked at the different arguments, first after mapping all of these developments, what are some of the reasons why we may be seeing this behavior? And, the two key questions really, we didn't really answer this, but try to identify what the key questions were. One was that is what we've seen this year from China, is it a momentary opportunism, or is it a part of a long-term trend? And again, this we'll only know in time. The second is it driven by is it driven by a sense of strength, or is it driven by a sense of vulnerability? And I think, again, there's indications to suggest all of the above, that perhaps they saw relations with the US as being on such a downward spiral that they went for broke, they had nothing to lose. Perhaps they saw the coronavirus as an opportunity to get as much done. I think in some ways the key indicator is Hong Kong, which is the national security law there. Why move at this point of time? I think it's when they felt they could get away with it with the least consequences. but it has had a major impact around the world, even in countries that were willing to give China the benefit of the doubt, including in Europe. Its actions on Hong Kong have really turned sentiment against China. And I think they're hoping that this will have short-term consequences for India, for China, for Europe and others. But so far, everything seems to suggest that this will have long-term implications for how others view China.
And then looking at China's sort of strategy over the past, decade and a half, you have the OBOR, the CPEC corridor, the polo string strategy of lending to governments, some say predatory lending, especially in Africa, as well as, naval exercises in the Indian Ocean, building naval assets in parts of the Indian Ocean. The net effect of this seems to be, at least in our minds, we feel encircled. And there is some evidence to suggest that even the physical assets of the Chinese around India suggest some degree of encirclement. What are some of India's efforts to counter this? And can you assess where we stand right now and what we need to do next?
Right. So, China has built up massive reserves and a great deal of debt as well, which it has now been exporting in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative. In some ways, it started in the early 2000s, but in 2013, it was given a formal name and became part of official policy as the One Belt, One Road, later we called the Belt and Road Initiative. And so a number of pre-existing projects were all wrapped up together into this broader umbrella of BRI. Where it is now, there's evidence of it, of this greater Chinese economic presence all over the world, from Latin America to Eastern Europe to Central Asia to South Asia, around India in the Indian Ocean region, and Africa and Southeast Asia. So there's no question now that China is a major player here. But I think we need to look at some of these things in perspective a little bit. The stock of overseas Chinese investment is recently surpassed that of Canada's. And if you look at the lending, it's still less than what Japan's overseas lending. So it's still a massive amount, and particularly massive amount relative to India.
Right.
But I think sometimes there's this tendency to look at it as this sort of unstoppable behemoth when the numbers don't quite add up. So, for example, just the China-Pakistan economic corridor, you see figures, particularly from the Pakistani side, that this will be about $60 billion. But the reality is, it's something. One estimation is it'll be more like $19 billion. So again, it's still a significant amount, but not again at the stage that sometimes it's been inflated into something much larger. What is India doing about it? So one is, to some extent, these are all sovereign countries. They make sovereign decisions themselves about what loans they can take and what economic arrangements they can enter into with other countries. You have changes in government in these places, which make it complicated. One leader will agree to something and another leader may not. But that being said, and so I think from an Indian point of view, to some extent, every country should be free to do what they want, as long as it doesn't impinge upon Indian security and Indian national interests. And there have been periods and episodes, particularly in the near abroad for India, where some of the Chinese influence does seem to have transgressed certain boundaries to impinge a little bit upon Indian interests. So what can India do? I think one is sort of simply, I say there are a few things India is doing. One is setting the norms of infrastructure financing. And this is evident in the first statement that India made in April of 2017, when it opted not to be represented at the Belt and Road Forum, which is it identified these are norms that India has a problem with. And specifically, those were lack of transparency, lack of economic sustainability, lack of environmental sustainability, lack of buy-in from the local population and benefits for the local population. And finally, sort of disrespect for the sovereignty of the recipient country. And what India basically said is, as long as any funding meets those criteria, India should have no problem with it, nor should anybody else. So in some ways, those norms have been the basis now for what we've seen Japan, the US develop in terms of norms for infrastructure financing. The second thing that India can do is actually, in some cases, match or compete with China. Now, India has doesn't have the same resources, so it'll have to be more judicious and select about where it can play a role. And nor can, even in some of these countries, can it match Chinese investment dollar for dollar. But if you look at the entire stock of Indian lending, it's about $25 billion overseas today, which is not it's still a fraction of what China does, but is not an insignificant amount either. And about half of that goes to South Asia, other South Asian countries. About 40% goes to Africa, and the rest to other countries, to Central Asia, Southeast Asia. So in some places, and in some cases, India can make the case that the projects that it is helping to finance actually have better long-term effects for the host country. So if you look at road and power projects in Bangladesh, hydropower in Nepal, railroads in Sri Lanka, healthcare in Afghanistan. And these are discrete projects that India is actually financing today. To not a lot of fanfare. There's no name for India's overseas investment. It's not played up, but it's not an insignificant amount. The third thing that India can do actually is work with other countries, either on joint projects or coordinating with them on their own projects. And so we've seen a degree of that emerge with respect to Japan in particular, but also others, Europeans, US, UK, Nepal, for example, where there is a degree of coordination because of shared concerns about overdependence on China. And sometimes the recipient country actually encourages this too, because they don't want to be overdependent on China either. So I think these are just some of the steps we've taken. They're very concrete. Will it be enough? We'll have to see. But I think we have to keep in mind the constraints that India also operates under, including the resource constraints.
I think the one thing that you mentioned is in order to compete with China, and in order to compete with China, we'll also have to look at sort of the instruments of our state capacity as they relate to the foreign services particularly. So I think Sanskruti has a few questions on IFS reforms and parallel entry, which we can get into.
Yes. So the IFS remains one of the smallest cadres relative to other civil services, such as the IAS or the IPS. And according to a 2016 Parliamentary Standing Committee briefing, we currently have around 2,700 diplomats, out of which only 912 are cadre, are IFS-A diplomats, which are trained diplomats, and then you have IFS-B, which are not so trained diplomats. And then a similarly bleak comparison emerges for the number of embassies, consulate, and high commissioners relative to both China and Brazil. And why do I say this is because Brazil has around, I have stats, and I think you are aware of the stats more than me. And Brazil has around 2,000 diplomats all across the world, and they have $1 trillion economy, less than that of India. So what does it have on the international standing, and what impact does it have on the Indian leadership that it wants to be the Vishwaguru, as it is called by the Indians? So, I mean, what kind of impact does it have?
Sure. So, I think it's something to keep in mind here. So there's no question that India has human capacity constraints in the public sector. And this is true across the board. It's and including the diplomatic corps. So, the thing I pointed out is you have 1,000 career diplomats, roughly 900. So it's increased a little bit in the last few years, but roughly 1,000 career diplomats. But you also only have 4,500 IAS officers who are supposed to govern the entire country, and not just the central government, but also the state governments. IPS is a little bit smaller than that, and they're supposed to provide law and order for the states and staff intelligence organizations as well. So India has a broader problem of civil service reform. And I am hesitant when a lot of people say you need to, India needs to increase the foreign service. The fact is, I don't think that will happen in a significant way. And there will be some increase around the margins, and some of that has happened. You can't have this whole-scale reform without whole-scale civil service reform. Because I don't think the powers that be, including in the finance ministry and others, will accept an IFS that is 4,000 size unless the IAS also grows. And then that gets into the question of, can the Indian state afford to increase the size of its overall bureaucracy? So, we can talk about this at length, and there are lots of articles written about lack of diplomatic capacity, but I don't think can be divorced from the lack of overall state capacity at all. And you have to address that issue head on if we want to see an expansion of the IFS. That being said, under the limited sort of constraints that India operates under, a few things to note. One is in terms of embassies, India has, barring the P5 countries and Germany, Japan, and Brazil, India has the largest number of countries and embassies, and there are 18 more embassies being opened in Africa now. So that in fact, I suspect it will surpass some of those countries in the near future. One could still say that's not enough, but that movement has been. The movement has been in that direction, so I suspect soon India will be comparable to most of the P5 countries in terms of. By the way, this comes at a time, by the way, where the UK and France are actually closing down missions in some countries. So, so I think that's one issue. Second is there's increased capacity. I don't have the numbers with me, but there's increased capacity being brought in from other services, so including into the MEA. So the number of military officers today stationed in MEA or deputy to MEA has grown significantly. There's a small consultants program of people who to be drawn from academia. That's not, unfortunately, expanded as quickly as many had hoped, but it remains there and remains active. You also have technical experts being brought into agencies such as the Development Partnership Association, the DPA. That's the three bureaus that provide foreign assistance. And one of the issues that had been a problem earlier was that there were challenges to the design of various projects and cost analysis and such like that. So technical experts are being brought in some of those domains. For the first time, this is quite significant. An external policy advisor was brought in, Ashok Malik, who's at the rank of additional secretary, which is quite a senior rank. And then a number of things are being outsourced to think tanks, including some of the convening functions. So, including the Rise in a Dialogue that ORF does, which has been around now for some years, and other such initiatives. So, again, in the absence of reform, we'll see perhaps a slow growth of the Foreign Service. Not that long ago, it was about 20 for each incoming batch. It briefly increased to over 40. Now it's 30 something. But we'll see it probably be about 40 in the near future. So over time, that will mean a sort of rough doubling of capacity. But more, I think equally significant is that a number of other things are being done, given the resource constraints, to bring in people from outside. To work on very specific areas. That being said, I think obviously there's a need for more whole-scale reform, but I don't see that happening without larger. This is my personal view. I think a bigger change is less the numbers, but more getting people into the Foreign Service who want to be Foreign Service officers. And today there's a generalist exam. You list your priorities of what service you want. But having maybe a separate Foreign Service exam, and there are, again, reasons why that does not happen, but I think that would be more important in time.
Definitely. And I think one of the few backlash on parallel entry into foreign services has been a lot of practitioners have spoken about this primarily because IFS is a very elite cadre, and the training that goes into IFS, the people who are brought into IFS or are brought into any other organization for that matter, they do not have that particular training. And I think this is something that I've read.
So I'm not as sympathetic to that argument, although I hear it a lot from current Foreign Service officers. See, I think there are two issues there. One is they think, people who are career bureaucrats think, I worked hard, I took the exam, I did well, I got in. Who are these people being parachuted in from outside? They didn't take the exam, or if they did, they didn't do well. So there is that. The second thing is their concerns, and people wrote about this when the consultants program was initiated circa 2015, 2016, that their concerns that it will mean less opportunities for career bureaucrats. So currently, pretty much all IFS officers will end up as an ambassador somewhere, right? And there are concerns that if people are brought in, that there'll be more limited opportunities for upward mobility amongst careers. So they are also a bit concerned about letting others in. I think a third issue where I'm slightly more sympathetic to this view is, I think there's a tendency on the part of people outside of government, and I count myself amongst them, to think, "Acha, we are smart, we know everything, we have all the answers," and there's an inability to work within large bureaucratic structures, and that is something. I mean, I think it's that more than anything else is what that training and years of training and experience impart, which is know your place in the hierarchy, know how to how to navigate a bureaucracy, know how to get things done, know when to shut up and take orders. And that is something that, I by the way, it's not just in India. I've seen this happen to a lot of people who are brought into government and suddenly find themselves out of their depth and end up getting pushed out and not being able to be effective. So I think, that can be addressed through a process of some training and sensitization to people who are brought in. I don't think that's an insurmountable challenge. But these, I think, are the very real complaints. I'm not very sympathetic to this idea that career diplomats are a fount of wisdom and know everything, and people outside don't. I think that's a very parochial view.
Definitely, there are two sides of every coin. I just wanted to clear the air. And yes, that's about. Why don't you, Abhishek?
I think that's all we have time for today. We've covered a lot of ground. Dhruva, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.